Why did the astronaut leave his wife? Because he needed his space. Lesson objective: understand and evaluate an example of the growth of tourism in an LIC. We are going to use the same case study here as Kenya. It's actually a separate part of the spec to the rest of the Kenya case study. However, we use the same case study to make it a little bit more straightforward. So a key learning here really to understand is that tourism can be a good way for countries to bring in money. It's hardly rocket science to work out that tourists, particularly from HICs, will arrive in LICs and will spend disposable income in shops and on services such as restaurants, transport, entertainment, whatever it might be. That therefore means that those companies obviously pay tax, and therefore the government can invest in schools and hospitals, etc., etc. Many NEEs and LICs have adopted this approach to pull in tourists. More and more will open up in your lifetimes of countries initially not deemed safe, but now deemed safe enough to travel to. Eritrea would be an example right now that's pushing for a new tourism market. Kenya benefits from tropical climates, exotic ecosystems, and beautiful landscapes that it hopes will attract tourists in. Tourists will travel and spend lots of money. What we hope to achieve is the positive multiplier effect. Now, you will have seen this on a separate video relating to ways to reduce the development gap, but with tourism we need a little bit more. We need to consider the advantages and disadvantages as well. I won't go back through this model. Have a little watch of the reducing the development gap video to go through it fully, but your specifics for tourism in Kenya are on the screen now. In class, you will have done the multiplier effect. I actually believe I spoke through it earlier. Growth in the number of jobs in tourist industry. Obviously, if tourists are arriving, businesses will need to employ more people to cater for them. So, for example, cafes, restaurants, etc., rather than just having their local Kenyan clientele, may now actually have clientele from across the world. As a result, take a restaurant, you will need to employ more waiters, more chefs, more cooks, potentially more bar staff, potentially more people to advertise to the foreign people who are arriving in hotels, and that therefore means you have a growth in the number of jobs. Furthermore, we will also have people will then obviously be earning more money in the tourist industry. Those local people then spend more money in the local businesses. Taxes to the government increase, and then crucially, the government can spend the money improving the infrastructure and the interactions to bring in more tourists. Now, later in the video, this could be one of the greatest criticisms of tourism as a way to reduce the development gap, but the concept being in this example that more tourists would arrive if the government is catering more for them by improving the infrastructure, for example, airport railways and roads to the airport. So the Kenyan government hopes to achieve economic development through tourism and tourist spending money in the country, alongside more jobs being created in the tourism and tertiary industries, so more people paying tax. In terms of the impacts of this, we have the social and economic impacts on Kenya. This is where this case needs a little bit more than perhaps the intermediate technology example did. So our first positive is £5 billion income from the tourists visiting Kenya means that the government has more money to spend on infrastructure. With that in mind, schools and hospitals can be improved, and that classic positive multiplier effect can be achieved. As we've already mentioned, we've created jobs for local people, maids and cooks, and also construction work for some of the projects that the government has been spending its money on. The spending in the local economy increases as tourists bring disposable income. As previously explained, the tourists may well buy souvenirs like key rings, etc., and that increases the amount of money in the local economy. But tourism brings negatives too. I'm going to start with the second one, which is that government spending is often focused on the needs of tourists. This has been an accusation made against many LICs around the world, particularly in the Caribbean, that their governments will take in the money that tourism is generating, but then reinvest the money back into the tourist infrastructure rather than that of the people. So, for example, in Kenya, the Kenyan superhighway was built connecting the airport to the main tourist area of Nairobi. The problem with that is the actual road doesn't necessarily benefit the majority of Kenyans. And when you have a figure that says 40% of the population of Kenya still live in extreme poverty, some serious questions need to be asked about the spending of the government of Kenya. Furthermore, in terms of tourism, your hotels are often foreign-owned hotels. They're the only companies that can go in and build new 5-star luxury resorts with swimming pools and car parks and etc., etc. As a result of being a foreign company, although yes, they pay tax, a lot of the money will be siphoned out of the country back to, for example, the UK, where the hotel has actually come from. The final one, before we go back to the top one, is that it does potentially create targets for terrorism, e.g. the 2019 hotel attacks that took place in Nairobi. However, the negative that I really want to focus on is the loss of culture. The Masai Mara, a group of people who live within the Masai lands, have been forced from their lands to cater for tourists. Tourists now go to visit the national park to see the animals and obviously spend a large amount of money on tour guides and then eating when they're there and drinking when they're there, etc. And what the Kenyan government has done is insisted the Masai Mara lose their nomadic culture. That's the culture of moving cattle around the national park that the people there have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Kenyan government has blocked that from happening to ensure that the grasslands themselves are preserved for the wild animals and to make it safer for tourists to venture in there as well. You wouldn't have like cattle rampages going on there. There are also environmental impacts on Kenya of tourists. Now, in direct what's the word when you're directly opposite, thank you. In direct opposition to the previous point on the Masai Mara, a positive for the environment is the creation of national parks protecting rare species. The money earned from tourism has been invested in digging ditches and also building fences. The ditches are used to make sure that 4x4s don't get too close to the animals, and fences obviously to keep tourists out of certain areas to protect the animals. Furthermore, from a more global perspective, the tourists leave educated on the issues and spread awareness of the Kenyan national parks. Certainly that's the hope of the Kenyan government anyway. However, if I link back to the top point, the protection of the rare species has actually been too successful. The fact that the animals are so well protected means that actually overbreeding has occurred, and as a result of that, overgrazing, with the animals now migrating away and leaving Tsavo National Park. There were actually calls to cull some of the wild animals in Kenya to ensure that actually the numbers didn't get to a stage where they would decimate the population by eating all of the grass. Tsavo National Park is a really good example where this has happened. Furthermore, obviously, the fact you've got 4x4s driving over a national park, it probably won't be a surprise that you have soil erosion by off-road vehicles. That therefore also reduces grassland for grazing and also reduces just simply the aesthetics of the region itself. On the coast, because obviously tourists aren't just attracted to national parks here, Kenya has a coastline with golden sandy beaches. Tourists have destroyed coral reefs by walking on the habitats and actually anchoring boats on there as well, destroying the coral reef, reducing the biodiversity of Kenya. So what we're all building to is this 6-mark question, using a case study to explain how tourism can promote economic development. As a 6-mark question, it's not asking as an evaluation as such. What we should be able to do after watching this video is to consider that not only will tax increase from businesses to lead to the investment in one of schools or hospitals, but also money in the local economy will also increase as well on the grounds that people who are being paid to work in the tourist industry will earn that money and then invest that in their local economy as well, also leading to that positive multiplier effect on the grounds that more tax will be paid and then can be invested into the other one you haven't spoken about, either schools or hospitals. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, the big evaluation point that I didn't put on the previous slide, remember with all of these that 40% of the Kenyan population still live in extreme poverty. Yes, tourism has benefited some people, but it surely has, or obviously has not benefited everybody. Come and see us down in H7 if there's anything you're not sure of, particularly the point regarding spending being focused on the tourist might be a bit tricky to get your head around. Come and see us if you're not too sure.